Although experiencing triggers is normal for most people, having to constantly deal with triggers that continuously come up very often can be tiresome, can be draining, can take a lot out of you. Hi, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Dr. Vanessa Milagros, and I'm a licensed mental health professional. On this channel, I make videos about relationships, mental health. So if you're interested in topics like that, make sure to subscribe and leave me a comment down below so I know that these are the type of videos that you want to see. Let's jump into today's video. Let's talk about what an attachment trigger is. And this is a moment that you experience that activates old emotional wounds that are tied to different things, such as wanting safety, love, and connection. That's why it's called an attachment trigger instead of just a trigger. So common attachment triggers are if somebody doesn't call back or text back, when you feel someone pulling away from you, being criticized, being ignored. Maybe you're vulnerable and that vulnerability is met with silence. And let's be clear, attachment triggers can be just as intense as any other triggers that you may experience. And the reason why it can feel so intense is because you're not reacting to what's actually going on right now, right? Somebody not calling or texting you back is not that big of a deal in the moment. You're reacting to then. You're reacting to old wounds, old experiences that you've had. So instead of just a situation of, hey, I reached out to them and they haven't responded, what's going on? You also have to add into that how you've been hurt in the past from people who you thought cared and loved about you, but they didn't. And they also didn't respond back to you. Maybe it's activated by your own insecurities of, I don't feel lovable. You're adding all of that and more into the context of what has happened. So you're not just dealing with the situation at hand. That's why it can feel so intense. So it becomes more of a, well, maybe they didn't respond because they're busy. It turns from that to, see, here you go. You're being abandoned again. You're not enough again. And I want to go a little bit deeper because I like to give you some of the science-based things of what's going on internally. Because as a therapist, we have to understand what our hormones are doing, what our nervous system is doing, what our brain is doing, how it's working. When we understand that, then we can understand and implement some of the things to do. So I'll take you through all that through this video, so don't worry. But let's start first with what's happening internally for you. So our attachments, and if you don't know what attachment styles are, I talk a lot about this on my channel, so just click this playlist up here. But if you do, stick with me. Your attachment styles, they're impacted by your amygdala, and that's a part in your brain, and your nervous system. Specifically with your nervous system, the patterns that are built from your early experiences with relationships. So this could be friendships, family relationships, caregiver relationships. And what happens is your triggers move you into fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses. And this whole pattern, this whole cycle, it disrupts your ability to remain rational. So it's not that you're crazy or you're doing too much. It's truly that a situation has happened, you start to remember things from your past in ways that you've been hurt or ways you've been abandoned, and then your amygdala starts to activate more and your nervous system is also activated, and all of these things are working sort of against us in that moment, against our ability to remain rational. And the best example that I have of this is when you're outside of that period of being triggered, you can look back and think, ooh, okay, not my best moment. And you can understand that your decisions or your thought patterns or your feelings that came up, your behaviors, that wasn't really rational. And you can see that afterwards. And you kind of blame yourself of like, why am I like this? Why do I do this? This is part of what's also working internally, what's also happening internally for you. Since we're on the topic of cycles, let's talk about the attachment trigger loop that usually tends to happen. And what we tend to see is that, let's say if you have an anxious attachment style, you have a trigger that happens, so maybe there's a delayed response in someone or their tone seems off and you're like, I don't know. That's the triggering event. So the common reaction for someone who has an anxious attachment style is to spiral, overthink, or engage in behaviors that are not necessarily the best. And we call this protest behaviors. What if you're avoidant? Well, if you're avoidant and the triggering event, let's say it's someone criticizes you or someone has an emotional need that feels a bit too much for you. Well, the response for you, the behavior for you ends up being a withdrawal, shutting down, or even pushing them away. So what if you have a disorganized attachment style? Well, maybe the trigger for you was that someone wanted to be too close, and for you, that's not what you wanted. Maybe they wanted to develop a deeper relationship with you and you weren't ready for that. Or maybe they became distant and you also didn't want that. Let's just take one of those examples. Well, the behavior for you in this loop, usually what we see is that those with the disorganized attachment style, they panic or they freeze or they go into an emotional chaos. So things don't seem right. They're feeling out of place. Now that we understand internally what's happening for you when you have an attachment trigger, and then we understand what some of the loops and the cycles are that we get into based on our attachment style, now let's actually talk about some of the things that most people don't take the time to explain. So the first tip that usually is given, I've given it too, is communicate. This is a healthy tip. This is a great tip. You do need to communicate. However, not when your brain is completely taken over by anxiety, not when your amygdala is going wild, not when internally your nervous system is not regulated. Having and practicing communication in those moments is never advised. Why? Because you aren't able to calm yourself down. You aren't able to regulate yourself first. You aren't able to think clearly in those moments. And so how is the expectation that you communicate? If you communicate during that state of mind, and you probably have, your communication is not healthy communication. And I guarantee you, your communication is probably going to be yelling. Your communication is probably going to be mean, unhealthy, unproductive, and potentially even toxic. You're not able to regulate yourself. How can you communicate clearly to somebody else in that state? The next is, most people give the advice of, okay, well, just think positively. And although this is so helpful to be able to think positively, not go straight to the negative, especially if you're more of a pessimistic person, yes, thinking positive is helpful. Not when you're in survival mode. That's not going to work for you in that moment. So here's what actually works. The first is working with your nervous system. Remember, we talked about the fact that your amygdala and your central nervous system work together. And so when you have an attachment trigger, these things are not regulated. So what you need to do is work on that first. Next is you have to learn to pause between the attachment trigger or the trigger that happens for you. You have to learn how to pause in between that and your response, the response that you give to it, the behavior that comes after. There has to be a pause in between. And last is you have to work on the wound beneath the trigger. See, we talked about this earlier. When you're able to understand, okay, it's not just the situation at hand, but it's all these memories that are coming back. It's all the self-esteem things that are coming up for you. It's everything from your past coming back up to validate, they don't care about me, I'm unlovable, you fill in the blank. You have to understand that that has to be worked on eventually. And this is why I always recommend starting therapy. When you can start individual therapy with a therapist that you can connect with a therapist that works in your specific area. So if you're going for trauma and trauma healing, find someone who specializes in that. If you're going for anxiety reduction or depression, find a therapist that specializes in that. Now I'm going to give you 5 steps and ways that you can rewire your specific attachment triggers. Remember what we talked about earlier with the loop and the cycle? We're going to have to interrupt that cycle. So I want you to name the trigger. What is actually triggering you in that moment? Say it out loud. Write it down. Then I want you to do something physical in order to interrupt that. So step outside, go on a walk, backtrack, do something other than what you're doing in that moment that you're triggered. Then I want you to say out loud, I'm triggered, but I'm not in danger. And what this does is this moves you out of the spiral and out of the autopilot that happens like that. And that's what we don't take the time to recognize. We have to interrupt that. Number 2, I want you to ask yourself a few questions. I want you to ask yourself, what does this situation mean to me? What am I afraid this situation says about me? What's the fear behind that? What old stories are coming up for me or playing out for me in this moment? And then after you honestly answer those questions, I want you to work on something with your therapist. So what I want you to do is work on reframing those thoughts. So for instance, I feel anxious, but that doesn't mean that I'm unlovable. See, we connect the feeling to what that means and says about us. But when we're able to reframe that and know that these are 2 different things and they are not correlated, there's strength in that. Then I want you to regulate first and respond later. So I want you to use grounding exercises such as 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique. Maybe do a voice note and don't send it to anybody. Do a voice note and that'll be a way of letting it out in that moment. And then give yourself a rule. Maybe it's that you need 24 hours before you respond in those situations. So give yourself that time limit of, I'm not responding to this until 24 hours from now, and stick true to that. Next is I want you to work on creating small responses so that you feel like I still got something out, but I didn't go overboard like I wanted to or like I usually do. So instead of sending a text, instead of sending paragraphs of text, go on a walk outside, journal, talk to someone else who's outside of the situation, but who's a good support system for you. Instead of shutting down, just say, you know what, I need a moment. I'm going to come back to this and actually come back. But remember, your brain, it learns through repetition, and doing something different that you're not used to, that's not comfortable for you, and that you probably don't want to do, is going to be really helpful because it lets your brain create a new pathway to make new choices, healthier decisions that are going to positively impact you. And the last step in rewiring your brain is to revisit and rehearse when you're calm. So remember how I said we have to redirect, we have to switch gears? Once you're done switching gears and actually working on grounding yourself and calming your nervous central system down, then you come back to revisit the situation. When you do that, I want you to ask yourself a few questions. And this is going to be your self-reflection period. Think about it like that. So what was I feeling underneath the trigger? What was the emotion or emotions? Write it down. How did I handle it this time when I practiced something new versus the last time? What helped me to be able to pause? What worked? It's important to remember that healing is not about perfection. Yes, you're going to feel triggered. This is going to happen from time to time. But the difference is you're going to actually have the tools that you're equipped with to be able to deal and go through the trigger without letting it take you out completely. Thank you so much for being here. Make sure to subscribe, like, and comment any questions you have for me down below. If you're interested in watching more of my videos, make sure to click this or this playlist right here. I'll catch you in the next video.